Hey everyone, Tin Man here with a guide to what is widely considered the best build in Teamfight Tactics in patch 10.8, Star Guardian Sorcerers, also sometimes referred to as egirls. This comp uses the massive mana generation from Star Guardians to throw spell after spell at your opponents, which include lots of stuns, large AoE damage, and single target bursts. This comp really just has it all. This guide will cover the core units, as well as the optional choices to complete the build, go over the key items on important units, discuss the reroll and level up strategy, positioning, and of course the most important part, when to actually play this build rather than just blindly forcing it every game. On to the core units. As the name implies, we're going to be playing all 6 of the Star Guardians. They scale so well together, with each one giving more mana to the others in a wonderful cycle. The 3 at the top here, Syndra, Nico, and Ahri, will be the ones dealing the bulk of the damage and will get most of the items. They are also the most important units to get up to 3-star. The other 3, Zoe, Poppy, and Soraka, are a little bit less impactful in terms of damage output, but obviously we still need them for their Star Guardian trait. And the Soraka healing is actually pretty nice in this build that has limited defensive options otherwise. Early in the game, you'll want to pick up Zoe and Poppy, often pairing them up with another Vanguard like Leona or Mordekaiser, throw in Ahri and Syndra as soon as you get them, and then you can fully transition over to 6 Star Guardians once you find Soraka. The build's key synergy doesn't really come online until you find all 6 of them though, so until you can, just play the best board possible, which will often be a mishmash of Vanguards, Sorcerers, Space Pirates, and sometimes Cybernetics, which are really strong in the early game. Once you have all 6 Star Guardians, that will leave us with 3 Sorcerers, but since most of our damage is going to come from spellcasts, it makes a lot of sense to bump that up to 4 Sorcerers, rather than, say, include an extra Protector, or Vanguard, or Mystic, which are the other missing synergies from the Star Guardians. For this purpose, Lux will be the most common unit to include at level 7, since she is relatively easy to find and level up, and also provides a nice stun to buy time for the rest of your team. Later on, you can look to Vel'Koz if you just want more raw damage output, and also the new Xerath unit is a very strong sorcerer, but is fairly rare for this build, since we'll be rerolling a lot at level 7, a little bit more on that later. 6 Star Guardians plus 1 additional Sorcerer will be the most common build that you play at level 7, but if you do get to level 8, then Lulu can be a good choice for more CC, and also give you Mystics, along with Soraka, to counter opposing magic damage. Otherwise, I'll often just put another Star Guardian in at level 8 if I don't have or don't want Lulu. Twisted Fate is also on the list here, as he is another sorcerer option, but he's definitely a lot less good in the late game than the other ones mentioned before, although he often makes appearance in this build early on, holding items until you find Syndra to transfer them over to. Speaking of items, the most important unit here to load up is going to be Syndra. She deals so much damage and really uses items very well. The best is easily Seraph's Embrace, which lets her cast quickly and then refill almost half of her mana pool right away after each cast. I always want a Seraph's on Syndra. It is the top priority for this build. A close second, though, is some sort of defensive option. I have Trap Claw shown here since it's pretty good to keep her safe from one spell, and it also uses 2 components, the Sparring Gloves and Giant's Belts, that are not really used much elsewhere in this build, making it pretty easy to complete most games. If you don't have a Trap Claw, then Guardian Angel or even Quicksilver can also work. For a third item, Chalice of Favor is insanely strong after its recent buff to give mana back to the holder, and with how often Syndra casts, it's a really great choice. Another Seraph's also works if you just have that many tiers. Also, you can put a spell power item like Rabadon's Deathcap or Luden's Echo on her, but honestly, she doesn't really lack for damage output. I generally think that mana is going to be more important on her, as her spells one-shot most enemies as long as she's casting enough. As for Nico, the second most important unit, she's going to be our lone frontliner in the late game, so she wants defensive options like Guardian Angel to ensure that she gets her cast off. If she does start to cast but then dies, the cast will finish as the GA is reviving her, so it's definitely the best item for Nico. Alternatively, Quicksilver or Trap Claw can also work, but do try for GA if possible. I also really like ZZ Rot Portal on Nico, since Nico will often die fairly quickly with or without GA, as she will be the lone frontliner. The ZZ Rot construct does give a little bit more tankiness to buy time for Syndra and the other sorcerers to cast a couple more spells. Also, there's really no other way to use recurve bows well in this build, so you often end up just making ZZ Rots out of any bows that you might randomly get off creep rounds. Also, Ionic Spark is really good since most enemies will be stacked up closely around Nico, as is Morellonomicon since her ult has a large AoE radius. The last unit that will load up is Ahri. She's definitely a lower priority than Syndra or Nico, but she can still carry fights as well, especially in the early game. Ahri can hold Chalice of Favor if the slots on Syndra are full, and other spell power items like Morellos and Rabadons are strong on Ahri. More than likely though, she'll just have whatever leftover items you can assemble, or just random completed items from say Kayn or the Carousel. Special note about the Star Guardian's Charm. This item does make a unit a Star Guardian, which is obviously great in this build. If you do get one, the best way to use it will be to replace Poppy, who is definitely the worst Star Guardian in the late game, and then put in 2 more Sorcerers, getting the total up to 6 Star Guardians and 6 Sorcerers at level 8. Ideally, this means Lux, Vel'Koz, and or Xerath, but in a pinch, Twisted Fate or Annie can work just to get up to 6 Sorcerers. One other note about Xerath, he can also be loaded up with items, much like Ahri, because he does a ton of damage and can definitely carry fights, especially if you do get him up to 2-star, although that will be quite rare in this build most of the time. But just keep that in the back of your mind, you can load up Xerath if possible. On to some of the strategy of leveling, rerolling, and gold management. One of the most important things for this comp is to actually lose in the early game, at least for the opening few PvP rounds. This will let you get an early pick on the first carousel in Stage 2, and hopefully let you pick up a Tear of the Goddess to make the all-important Seraph's Embrace and Chalice of Favor. It's super important to get a Seraph's Embrace and hopefully Chalice as well in this build, so you need Tears of the Goddess, and losing a little bit of health in the early game to ensure that you get one is definitely a very worthwhile trade. Hopefully, it also blocks opponents from grabbing Tears as well, meaning that they'll be less likely to contest you for this build. Don't stay weak for too terribly long though, make sure you do balance getting some strong units in the early game so that you don't lose to the Terrabusters, the first creep round that can actually give weak compositions some trouble at the end of Stage 2. After that, a typical leveling strategy will involve getting up to level 6 by round 3.5, and then up to 7 by round 4.1, just spending the gold above 50 for the maximum amount of interest. Once you do hit level 7, then you can get the full build of 6 Star Guardians plus 4 Sorcerers online, and then it's a good idea to reroll some of that at that level to hit your 3-star units. Depending on how stages 2 and 3 went, you might be pretty low on life at this point as you're transitioning from early game units to a full build, so it's okay to reroll a little bit on round 4.1, even dropping below 50 gold, maybe going down to 40 or 30 gold, just to make sure that you can find one copy of all of your key units, plus find a few key upgrades to hopefully stem the bleeding. But if you're not too low, if you're already pretty strong, you know those stages went pretty well for you, just reroll the excess gold above 50 rather than splurge it all right away until you do start dropping low and you need to really beef up your comp. As for leveling beyond 7, that is more on a case-by-case basis. Ideally, you hit 3 stars on Syndra, Nico, and Ahri before leveling up, since those are going to be your most important units. Of course, you won't always get them to 3-star every game, so you do want to prioritize Syndra first, then Nico, and then Ahri, and be sure to scout out opposing players to see how many copies of these units that they are picking up, and to evaluate whether or not it's possible or worthwhile to continue searching for those 3 stars, or to just level up for an extra unit. Other than waiting for all the 3 stars, you might get a Star Guardian's Charm as well, and then either items from the Raptors, or maybe you get it completed off Kayn or a Carousel. In that case, you might want to level up to 8 quickly, cut Poppy, and add in the 2 more Sorcerers, as discussed earlier. Also, I almost never get up to level 9 with this build. It's simply too expensive with all the rerolls, and there's nothing really that appealing to put in at that point. This build really spikes at level 7 and into level 8. Level 9, there's just nothing great that you really want to do with that level. Here's a sample positioning. A few things to note. First, Nico is alone up front. This lets most enemies bunch up around her, and they can all get hit by her ult. Earlier in the game, before Nico is leveled up, or before she gets some good tanky items, you can put Poppy up there right next to her to split the damage from opponents to ensure that Nico doesn't die before casting. But once Nico's tanky enough, maybe has a GA or at least gets to 2-star, then you can let her stay up front alone. The backline positioning is kind of flexible in terms of exactly who goes where, but if you do have a Chalice, make sure you place it closer to the middle to give the maximum amount of mana benefit. On the corners, you can place the least important units, like Zoe and Poppy, to bait out any opposing Blitzcrank hooks. In the late game, make sure you scout out opposing Zephyrs and Infiltrators, who will jump straight ahead, and make sure that your Syndra, Nico, and Ahri are going to be as safe as possible, and then adjust your positioning accordingly. And finally, the most important part, when to play this build. I think that the most important part of this build is having Tear of the Goddess in the early game. As mentioned earlier, Seraph's Embrace and Chalice of Favor are just so strong and so important to the build that you really want to ensure that your units are constantly casting that. So ideally, that you have at least 2 Tears by the end of the stage 2 carousel. So maybe you pick one up off the initial carousel, you get one off the creep round, you try to pick one up on the first carousel. Otherwise, since this is a really reroll heavy build, you don't really want to be contested too heavily. There are not enough units in the pool for multiple people to get 3 stars on the 3-cost units like Nico and Syndra. So be aware, if there are other people going for them, then you either want to reroll more aggressively to find them first, or just be okay with playing, say, 2-star Syndra or 2-star Nico, and then level up a little bit more to add in more units like Vel'Koz and Xerath to make up for the difference. And finally, you can build into this with a variety of early game starts, but good units to have that would indicate you might want to go this way are going to be 2-star Zoe, Twisted Fate, and Ahri. An early game where you're playing, say, Vanguards and Space Pirates also transitions well into this build, since you're probably going to be picking up Poppy and units like Graves or Darius to hold mana items and spell power items really well until you get a Syndra online. That's it for this guide. Please make sure to like and subscribe, and if you do enjoy this content and want to see more of it, please consider supporting me by joining the channel. It really does help me out a whole lot. Big thanks to all of my supporters, and extra special thanks to my Lord tier channel member, John Vise. Thank you all so very much for watching, and I will see you next time.